longer than Zelensky will survive. I just hope the Ukrainian government understands the reality of the situation that they live in. That if Russia goes to war against Ukraine, Zelensky dies day one. Zaluzhny dies day one. They will literally take out the collective leadership and all the decision-making centers of Ukraine. You know, when I just remember Desert Storm, I know it was a long time ago, going over the initial target list and just looking at who we were trying to kill and why we were trying to kill. We were out to decapitate the Iraqi leadership day one. Why? It's a legitimate target of war. It's a command and control, a leadership target. We had every right to go after that. Why didn't Russia do that to Ukraine? Because they're not in the business of trying to go to war against Ukraine. Russia's objectives in phase one were to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, to negotiate a peace settlement as soon as possible. They actually had one on the table in Istanbul on 1 April that could have brought an end to this conflict. But you can't talk about negotiations if you're in the business of killing the very leadership you're trying to negotiate with. So Russia's never been in the business of killing Zelensky. And Russia has shown a great deal of tolerance in receiving Ukrainian attacks against its own infrastructure, its own territory, because Russia understands you can't pummel a nation and expect a political leadership not to defend themselves. And so, you know, Ukraine has sent drones into the strategic depth of Russia, and Russia hasn't turned around to kill Zelensky. Ukraine's blown up the Crimea Bridge. Russia hasn't turned around to kill Zelensky because ultimately the Russian goal is to have a negotiated settlement, and they need a Ukrainian government. But now if Ukraine on its own volition attacks Transnistria, that is an attack against Russia that's independent of everything else that's going on. And Russia says we will treat this as an act of war. And what that means is the moment Ukrainian troops cross, Zelensky's going to die, Zaluzhny is going to die, the parliament's going to die, the command centers will be taken out. And then they will also turn to critical lines of communications, all the rail lines, all the roads, all the tunnels, all the bridges will be dropped because this is war. And also understand that, you know, the Ukrainians have amassed 20 to 25,000 troops. The Russians have, you know, upward of 5,000 to 6,000 troops in Transnistria, but there's another 10, 15,000 local militias that have a certain capability. The Ukrainians don't have sufficient resources to defeat the Russians in Transnistria. So the Russians will hold out, and the end result will be the death of the Ukrainian leadership. And I think the Ukrainian leadership knows this. One, that they're not going to achieve a military victory. And two, if they try to achieve a military victory, they won't be there to enjoy it because they'll all be dead. So here's what I think is really going on right now. I think the Ukrainians have positioned troops there to create the potential of an incursion against Transnistria. And why is this important? Not because of the 6,000 troops in Transnistria. They're there. What's important is how would the Russians respond? I already told you that they would need to have a very significant focused air campaign. This means that aircraft have to be set aside, earmarked for this campaign. They had to be made ready. They can't be off doing other missions. And munitions have to be set aside. Inzal missiles, other precision calibers, etc. Missiles that could be otherwise used to target the rest of Ukraine have to be set aside, held in reserve, in readiness to respond to any action. So that's a plus for Ukraine. By threatening Transnistria, they've compelled the Russians to withdraw significant military power. It also means that the Russians have to have a plan in place how to quickly come to the relief of Transnistria, which means a military campaign across the Odessa land bridge. Now, the plan not only has to be on paper, but they have to have forces that have been earmarked for this plan. That means those forces can't become decisively engaged in the ongoing conflict, in eastern Ukraine. These forces will have to be sort of held in a ready reserve. Again, denying Russia resources for the fight because of the threat against Transnistria. So I think that's what the Ukrainians are doing. I think they're playing a little bit of gamesmanship. They're moving pawns around the board. They're freezing Russian pieces in place. They're forcing the Russians to hold forces back. And in that case, it's genius. It's a brilliant move. It's good on whoever came up with that. But hopefully, they don't ever think that that they should act on this, because that would be suicidal. What's going on to the fighting that took place on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1944 that led to what's been called the Destruction of Army Group Center, which is basically that big German military force right there in the center of the Soviet Union. And they just basically collapsed. Their forces, their structures collapsed. People were running to the rear. The Soviets were moving forward, capturing hundreds of thousands, killing hundreds of thousands. And I see that happening. But in order to get that collapse, remember, prior to that, the Germans had a very cohesive defense. The Russians, the Soviets would launch attacks and beating their head on the wall. Basically, by maneuvering, by accruing fire superiority, by wearing the Germans down, they eventually got the whole system to collapse. And I think that's what's going on right now. A lot of people are saying, when will the Russian offensive begin? I think it's begun. I think we're well into the offensive because, A, it's never stopped. Bakhmut didn't just happen overnight. It's been going on since May. It's been a meat grinder in the Bakhmut Soledar area for since May, and it's going on today. The Russians are finally getting to the position where they may. I think they've achieved an encirclement by fire. They may get the physical encirclement soon, and whoever's left in the cauldron that created. So sad, too bad, wouldn't want to be you. The Russians are in the business of destroying the Ukrainian military. You don't have to maneuver decisively to achieve that if the Ukrainians are going to allow themselves to be drawn into a war of attrition where all the advantages accrue to Russia. And that's what's happening right now. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian dead. The equipment that has been provided is being destroyed. This is why the Ukrainians are out begging for new equipment, carrying out grotesque mobilization, literally stealing men off the streets to fill the ranks. They are in desperate straits. But the most telling part of this, remember, war is, anybody who's been to war will tell you that it's more important to have beans, bullets, and bandages than it is to have a clever guy to draw arrows on a map. That war is won by logistics. The fact of the matter is, the most important logistic aspect of this conflict is artillery ammunition. This is a war that's defined by the respective artillery forces of either side. And the Ukrainians are going to run out of ammunition in summer. It's not me making that up. I've been saying this for some time, but now we have Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, saying, yeah, they're going to run out this summer. There's nothing we can do in the West to change that. We don't have the ability to generate new production or acquire reserves that wouldn't act to the detriment of our own ability to wage conflict. Ukraine's going to run out of ammunition, and when you run out of ammunition, especially artillery in an artillery-driven war, collapse occurs. So I think what we're going to see is you're not going to see in the near future. Look, the Russians will do what the map dictates. I think right now they're in the process of shaping the battlefield, getting the Ukrainians to commit reserves, to identify gaps that can be exploited. The Russian advance will take place as the battlefield conditions dictate. I don't think the Russians are going to try and force anything. I think the Russians are going to put pressure along as they are doing right now, because it's not just in Bakhmut where the offensive is taking place. It's in Zaporizhia, it's in Uladar, it's in Krasny Limon up in that area. Some pop coming down around in the Sumy area. It's just a broad-based offensive that's putting pressure on the Ukrainians, forcing them to parse out their precious reserves and to expend ammunition that they don't have. How do you break up a Russian attack? With artillery. So every time the Russians attack, they're compelling the Ukrainians to fire more artillery rounds that they don't have anymore. And eventually you get them to, run out of ammunition. And now the next time you attack, there won't be anything to break up your attack, and the attack will go forward successfully. So I think the Russians are in the business of wearing the Ukrainians down to the point of collapse. And I think the collapse will occur sometime this summer. And then, how far will Russia advance and on what speed? I think the Russians have made it clear. Listen to Vladimir Putin in his address. He said that the primary focus is to reconstitute the economic and social systems of the new territories, Novorossiya, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Donbass and Lugansk. So they're focusing on making these livable spaces. And a key aspect of making that a livable space is, A, kicking the Ukrainians out of all the territory, which is what the Russians are doing. And then what the Russians have said is that they're going to push the Ukrainians back to the range of the longest, of the most capable system that the West has provided. When Russia first made that statement, you were looking at around a 45-kilometer buffer zone that would have to be created. But then we gave them HIMARS, and so bam, 80+ kilometers. Now we've given them a new kind of munition for the HIMARS, a small bomb guided missile or whatever, 150 kilometers. And when you take Juan, you're old enough, Angry Walker, I don't know if you were a computer kind of guy, but we used to do maps with overlays and grease pencils. We didn't do any of this computer crap. It was old school. You had your map here, you unfolded it, you got your grease pencil, and you wrote on it. If you make a mistake, you spit it off and you rub it off. And we used a compass, and you take the scale and you draw your circles and you navigate this way. So old school tells me lay out a map, look at the boundaries of Kherson, not where Ukrainian troops are, but what Russia considers to be Russia on the map, and then draw a 150-kilometer arc along that the border. And you're going to see that the Russians are going to be taking places like Odessa, Kharkov. They might be taking Dnipropetrovsk. So the conflict is being defined not by what Russia wants to do, but what Russia is being compelled to do based upon the actions of NATO and the United States in supplying the Ukrainians. I think that's going to dictate pace of advance, et cetera. Russians in the business of killing Ukrainians and minimizing the number of Russian dead. As much as we focus on Ukrainian casualties, I think we need to be clear that Russia has suffered significant casualties themselves, not to the scope and scale of it. Don't believe anything coming out of the New York Times or the Biden administration. But I think if you were talking between 35 and 45,000 dead Russians, you wouldn't be too far off. That's a big number. That's 1 year's worth of dead. That's getting that means Russia's on course to surpass the number of dead 58,000 Americans killed in the Vietnam conflict over the course of 10 years. Russia's getting ready to surpass that in less than a year and a half. It's heavy fighting, guys. Again, the Ukrainians have lost, they're on the verge of losing what the United States lost in a two-front war in World War II. But Russia's getting ready to lose numbers that match that which we lost in Vietnam. This is a bloody, bloody, bloody conflict. The consequences of this are going to resonate for decades amongst the families that are affected. The genetic treasure of a nation is being wasted on the battlefield. Men who should be having children and passing on, their genes are being slaughtered. So we're denying both Ukraine and Russia, a valuable genetic pool. Families that should be raising children in a healthy family environment are going to find their father's no longer there. Maybe their mother's no longer there because of bombardment. Kids will be scarred physically, emotionally, mentally. Try moving into adulthood carrying that kind of baggage. This war is devastating both Ukraine and Russian societies. And yet here in the West, we're just so, rah, rah, hoorah, let's do it. Fight to the last Ukrainian. Let's give them a couple $1 billion more. All you're doing is condemning people to die and people to suffer. I'll answer the second part first. No. I think the Polish, when you say Polish army, that means organized formations of the Polish military.
The regulars.
Currently in Poland, moving in as Polish formations in the U.S. and Ukraine. No.
Okay.
It's suicide. The Polish army is not very good under any circumstance. I mean, they've got some special forces guys that we use, the Grom. We used them in 2003 to assist in our illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, and we've trained extensively with them, and they're pretty good. But they're special forces. You don't win wars with special forces. You win wars with just standard grunts, tank drivers, truck drivers, people of that nature. General Cavoli is the commander of Lieutenant General, commander of American forces in Europe and commander, Supreme Allied Commander of all NATO ground forces. Spoke in Sweden last month, and he said that what's happening in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of NATO. NATO never imagined this kind of fight. Therefore, NATO's not trained to fight, organized to fight, prepared to fight this kind of fight. And one of the main things is the amount of artillery that's being expended. They're using artillery at a rate that NATO can't sustain. They don't have the ammunition for that. And if you've got an American general basically saying that an American unit is not ready for that fight, What's that tell you about the Polish army? Because they're not good. They're not good. There's hardly any good NATO militaries out there. I mean, even look at the British. British used to be the epitome of professionalism. I'm sure at the individual level, there are some British units, the paratroopers. I don't even, do you guys have the green jackets anymore, or have they been amalgamated into something? Who knows? But, I believe that the individual British soldier is a high quality soldier. I think they have good training. They have decent personal kit, individual weapons. But beyond that, they can't fight, because combat isn't about the individual performance. Combat's how you perform as a team. And the team that the British have to be talking about putting on a modern battlefield, like the one in Ukraine, is at least a brigade. And the British can't get a brigade right now. Don't have the ability. You could put the entire British Army in a big soccer stadium and have 30,000 unsold seats. Wallace and the British General Staff have acknowledged they have enough ammunition to last them, 7 days? I actually think the ammunition expenditure rate is higher than that. They'd rather have ammunition in 2 or 3 days. Then they're all dead. So the British Army can't fight this fight. The Dutch can't fight this fight. The Poles can't fight this fight. The French can't fight. The Germans damn sure can't fight this fight. The Americans we could start this fight, but we can't finish the fight because we don't have sustainability. This is the fact. So the Poles know that they can't project power into Western Ukraine traditionally. What they can do is what they are doing. And I don't know the exact numbers. I've heard Colonel McGregor, who I respect tremendously, put some numbers on there about the numbers of Polish troops. I've heard Russian figures, but as much as I respect the Russians, they're as guilty as everybody is of propaganda when needed, and exaggerating threats and minimizing losses. That's what you do. It's not a crime. It's the reality of war. So the Russians tend to, emphasize a very large presence of Poles. We hear anecdotal information about radio intercepts of the soldiers fighting them in Lugansk and Donetsk, and almost every person says the majority of the voices they hear are Polish voices. And we see, information about Polish soldiers being killed there and everywhere. And there's talk about thousands of dead Poles going back to Poland and being buried. So there's that. But now the Poles are getting ready to create something they call the Polish Legion, which is supposed to be a force of Polish veterans who will come together and then be organized and then sent over and transferred to the control of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. What's interesting in Polish Legion is I can almost guarantee you that this is an initiative not of the Polish Ministry of Defense, but of security services. And that the purpose of it is to have a Polish force in place in Ukraine in case they want to do something like seize control, etc. But the Russians aren't stupid. That's why they've built this group of forces up in Belarus, and they'll be prepared to do that. But I don't see the Poles going in on that. Now, part one of your question, which I forgot because I'm old and senile.
Ukrainian defectors.
The Ukrainian defector. Vladimir Putin gave a speech today to the FSB, which is the old KGB used to be a sort of a monolithic security service. They had different directors to the KGB that were responsible for either foreign intelligence or domestic intelligence, things of that nature. In the post-Cold War, the foreign intelligence people have broken off into what they call the SVR, and the domestic intelligence people are in what they call the FSB, the Federal Security Service. The FSB, though, is responsible for what they call the near abroad because they inherited the responsibility of security in former Soviet republics. So that's not an SVR target, that's an FSB target. So therefore, Ukraine is an FSB area of operations. So Putin is talking to the FSB and he's congratulating them on the significant role that they've played in here. And he spoke of, the various things that they do, from counterterrorism to fighting corruption to fighting against saboteurs, et cetera. And he spoke about FSB units operating behind enemy lines. And so what I'm trying to get at is that the FSB is heavily engaged in this. And one of the jobs of the FSB is human intelligence. Defectors. I can say this as not only an intelligent officer, Juan, but an intelligence officer who has familiarity with handling defectors. That the ideal defector is the one who defects in place. So they say, we disagree with what's going on, but we're going to come over to you, but we're going to stay in place and provide you with information or somehow participate in a way that influences the battle to your benefit, etc. There was talk of one of the Ukrainian negotiators that was involved in the first round of negotiations was assassinated on the streets by the Ukrainian SBU. And there's some confusion. Some people say he was working for the Ukrainian military intelligence to set himself up as a Russian double agent, meaning the Russians thought they recruited him. He was actually being controlled by. So there's a spy versus spy game. We know that's taking place. So I would assume that the Russians have recruited defectors in place, people who have defected, who are in place, who are in the government, who are providing intelligence support. I would also assume that there are Ukrainians who have gone over to the Russian side. Then, of course, one way of defecting, of course, is the old rookie there. Put your hands up and just walk. Right? The Russians don't shoot, then they take you prisoner, and you're taken out of the battlefield. And that's happening on a larger number. I think that is the case, and I would anticipate as this war continues, we're going to see more and more of that. You know, take a look at the enthusiasm that the Ukrainians have for what they call cleansing or filtering operations when they come back into areas that had been occupied by the Russians, or when they are operating in areas that are near Russian forces. They cleanse, and they've had these guys brag. One guy actually bragged, a Ukrainian thug from Azov bragged that they're going to have to do a census afterwards to find out who's alive, because we've killed thousands, but we can't even keep track of who they are. We just take them out, we shoot them, and dump their bodies. And so the Ukrainians are very fearful people who are collaborating with the Russians, and this would fall into the category of defector in some cases. I think it's happening. I can't give you a name of a prominent defector, again, because probably the most important ones, they want them to either stay in place or they don't want to advertise that they've come over, because then the Ukrainians can carry out effective security measures to isolate what they knew, to do damage, controlled damage mitigation, et cetera. From an intelligence standpoint, you want to be able to exploit the knowledge that's in the person's head to the best of your advantage. And the best way to exploit it is if the other side doesn't realize that you have access to it. So there's a big intelligence game being played on, and there's no doubt in my mind. But it cuts two ways, too. You remember, there's a lot of concern about from many Russians. You hear a lot of speculation about this at the I'm not going to call it pro-Russian blogs. I'll call it the more extreme blogs who are against Putin. They're against the general staff, and you hear a lot of them talk about various Russian officials they say have relatives in Ukraine and therefore are suspect, and that they believe that they're passing information on to the Ukrainians, et cetera. So it's a two-way street. I think we have an intelligence game being played that goes down. But according to information coming from Bakhmut, the majority of the Ukrainian casualties that are the bodies being recovered based upon the paperwork that's in the bodies, are Western Ukrainians, people from Lvov and that area. These are the true fanatics. These are the people you would expect to fight to the death. The ethnic Russian population or the sort of neutral Ukrainian population are either dead, wounded, deserted, captured, but they're running out of those bodies. They're now bringing bodies in from Western Ukraine, from Transcarpathia, from other areas like that. I think one of the strategic mistakes made by Russia, and this again, it's dangerous to make definitive judgments early on in the conflict. Even though we're a year on, there's still a lot of unknowns out there. But it appears that the Russians made, for instance, listening to Vladimir Putin's justification for going in, he speaks of the artificiality of the Ukrainian state and the single. The fact that the Russians and Ukraine are the same people, and therefore they're brothers and they should be working together. And there's many people in Ukraine that believe that, who do that. But since 1990, and even prior to that, since 1956, actually, when Khrushchev released the Banderists, hundreds of thousands of them, hardliners who had been captured during this decade-long struggle from 44 to 53, 54, where 250,000 Russians were killed, 50,000 Russian security forces killed, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian resistance killed, hundreds of thousands captured. It was a major war that was being fought on behalf of what was called Ukrainian nationalism, the perverted notion promoted by Bandera. These guys were released in 56, and they were brought back into Ukrainian society. They started having an impact on Ukrainian society. And it was sort of initially started off as sort of like an underground movement, a guerrilla movement, intellectual guerrilla movement, promoting Ukrainian nationalism over Russia, etc. And in 1990, it made the jump from nowhere to everywhere. Now they're now promoting actively Ukrainian nationalism. You know, the political parties couldn't garner more than 3, 4, 5% support. The ideas of Ukrainian nationalism became embraced, and you have entire generations of people, and and to forget people like me who were born in the 60s. We got to understand that if you're born in the 90s, that you're 30 years, 32 years old today. And all you've ever known was post-Soviet experience. And if you were raised in the 90s as a child in the early 2000s, Ukrainian nationalism was pushed down your throat over and over and over again. So I think the Russians got it wrong on Ukraine. Yes, the ethnic Russians sided with Russia, but the average Ukrainians, I believe in Ukraine, however you want to define it. There's some in Western Ukraine that define it in the model of Stepan Bandera, but there are the others there who believe in Ukraine, for better or for worse. This is my country. This is my soil. I don't necessarily agree with the government, but this is my homeland. And so when you come into my homeland, I'm going to defend my homeland. And I think there is an entire generations of Ukrainian patriots who may disagree with Zelensky, may disagree with Banderists, but are willing to fight and die for their homeland. We can sit here and say how misguided they are, but it doesn't matter because they're fighting. As you pointed out, why are they fighting? Well, they believe in something. And what they believe in is a vision of Ukraine that doesn't tolerate foreign forces coming in. And remember, while the Russians have this brotherly love for Ukrainians, and I believe it's genuine, Ukraine has been raised to call the Russians Moskwa, which is an insult, sort of a Muscovite. They've been trained to treat the Russians as sort of subhumans, lesser people, not as smart, not as culturally advanced, just those peasants over there. They call them orcs. We've seen this where they take Russians and they paint their face green with this medicine, this ointment, and then they saran wrap them to poles and beat them and sometimes leave them there to die. There is an entire generation of Ukrainians who've been raised to hate Russians, literally raised from childhood to hate Russians and to treat Russians as lesser people, as subhumans, which is why they do the things they do. I mean, one of the reasons why you go around and you shoot Russian prisoners of war is you're not viewing them as equals, you're viewing them as lessers. These are lesser people, subhumans, therefore it's okay to shoot them because they're not real people. The same thing with Russians, ethnic Russians. They denigrate, they carry out cultural genocide, they don't respect the religion, the culture, the language. There is an entire generation of Ukrainians that were raised this way. And so if you're raised to hate, don't be surprised that you learn to hate. And there's a lot of hatred on the battlefield right now. A lot of Ukrainians that are fighting the Russians because A, they believe they're defending their homeland, and B, they hate the Russians. They just simply straight up hate the Russians, which is why you see all of this cruelty. Unfortunately, this means that the Ukrainian ability to resist is going to extend as long as they have the manpower willing to fight and die for their country. They have equipment to equip them and ammunition to continue the fight. The good news is they're running out of manpower. That's bad news, actually, because it means a lot of them are dying. And they're running out of ammunition. That's actually bad news, too, because it means when they run out of ammunition, there will be a collapse. And that collapse isn't an academic collapse. It's a collapse that happens when people stop fighting, stop resisting in a cohesive fashion, and they are going to be swamped by a Russian offensive that's coming in for the purpose of not taking them prisoner, but killing them. And again, I just come back to anybody who thinks that you're helping the Ukrainians out by continuing this resistance, you're just dead wrong. You're dead wrong. You're just condemning hundreds of thousands more men to die, tens of millions of more women and children to be displaced, and an entire generation of Ukrainians to be tormented by post-traumatic stress disorder.